You want to know the one thing that gets a narcissist to say sorry? The same person who once declared your suffering wasn't real. It's not pleading, it's not trying to reason, it's something much quieter and much more effective. Because when you do this, their certainty wavers, their confidence falters, and they return with the closest thing to taking responsibility they are capable of giving. Before I explain precisely how to uphold those limits without falling back into old habits, please hit that like button and stick with me, because this next part is when everything finally clicks. Narcissists don't apologize out of compassion because empathy isn't what drives their interactions. What motivates them is supply, attention, approval, power, adoration, and control. When a narcissist hurts you, they aren't evaluating the emotional impact on you. They're evaluating the impact on themselves. Did this pain threaten their self-image, their comfort, their access to what they desire, or their feeling of being superior? If the answer is no, then there is no internal motivation for them to feel regret. Their emotional makeup prioritizes self-preservation over connection, which is why they can disregard your distress with shocking detachment. But the moment the results of their behavior begin to inconvenience them, the situation changes. If you withhold your focus, stop participating in arguments, stop trying to justify your feelings, and remove the emotional energy that once fed them, they experience a break in their supply. That interruption is what gets their attention, not feeling sorry for you. This is why their apologies often surface only when their access to you is at risk, when you become unavailable, or when their control starts to slip away. They begin to realize that their actions have a price, and narcissists despise paying emotional prices. Their version of an apology is transactional. It's a tactic to restore balance, not a true expression of understanding. When the environment around them shifts and you no longer serve as the emotional cushion they depend on, they sense a danger. The danger might be losing you, losing adoration, losing stability, or losing their preferred image. To counteract that danger, they might offer something that looks like taking responsibility. They aren't suddenly gaining empathy. They're trying to reclaim a benefit they fear is slipping away. This is why the calm removal of your energy impacts them more than an emotional confrontation. Your lack of reaction highlights the fact that they are losing influence. And for someone who relies on control and attention for survival, that loss is unbearable. The apology that appears is simply their method of restoring the balance that benefits them most. Your emotional withdrawal is more powerful than fighting because narcissists are sustained by emotional intensity, not emotional insight. When you confront them with anger, distress, explanations, or pleas for things to change, you think you're communicating your suffering, but what they see is engagement. Engagement means they still matter to you, still affect you, still occupy space in your emotional world without effort. This is supply, and it keeps them energized. Even negative emotions feel like confirmation that they still hold power. But emotional withdrawal creates a different situation, one they are unprepared to handle. When you stop reacting, when your tone becomes steady and measured, when you stop trying to persuade them of your viewpoint, the entire system they rely on collapses. You are no longer a predictable source of validation or emotional stimulation. You become neutral, and neutrality is their weakness. Emotional withdrawal isn't the cold shoulder or punishment, it's stepping out of the role they expect you to perform. Instead of begging, you become factual. Instead of justifying, you become brief. Instead of arguing, you protect your limits and your energy. This deprives them of the cycle of drama that maintains their feeling of being superior or in charge. Narcissists require emotional reactions to maintain their psychological dominance. They provoke to keep you off balance. They criticize to make you defend yourself. They use guilt to make you explain. When you emotionally withdraw, you deny them access to the reactions that fuel their sense of power. This withdrawal forces them into an uncomfortable situation. Suddenly, they are unable to read you. They can't guess what you'll do. They can't draw you back in with guilt, charm, or threats. They can't trigger you into a fight. Your calm becomes disturbing because narcissists interpret a lack of emotion as a lack of control. They start wondering if they are losing their hold on you, and that fear drives them into actions they typically avoid, including apologizing. They do this to reestablish emotional connection, not because they genuinely understand your pain. Your emotional distance signals that they're no longer affecting you the way they used to. And that loss of influence becomes the pressure that compels them to act differently. Boundaries only work when they are supported by consistent action, because narcissists don't respond to words, feelings, or promises. They respond to results. You can state a limit 100 times, but if you continue to tolerate the behavior, the limit becomes useless. Narcissists test boundaries constantly. They watch closely to see if your no is genuine or if it can be coerced, guilted, manipulated, or emotionally worn down into a simple whatever. The moment they see an inconsistency, they interpret it as permission. This is why boundaries with a narcissist must be firm, calm, and consistently enforced. Otherwise, they become chances for exploitation rather than protection. When you support a boundary with action, you change the dynamic from an emotional negotiation to an undeniable reality. Instead of trying to convince them why their behavior hurt you, you change how you respond to it. If they shout, you leave the room. If they insult you, you end the conversation. If they violate a limit you've stated, you decrease contact or access. The key is following through. Narcissists push because they expect you to give in. When you don't, you disrupt their internal map of how to control you. Consistency becomes the shock that breaks their feeling of entitlement because it shows them for the first time that their methods are ineffective. Consistent boundaries also change you. You stop reacting out of fear, guilt, or old emotional habits. You start acting from self-respect. This creates a stable environment where you no longer reward their poor behavior with attention, emotional justifications, or engagement. Narcissists are not used to this kind of stability. They are used to cycles of chaos where they provoke, you react, and they regain power. A consistent boundary breaks that cycle. They eventually realize that certain actions lead to real consequences, whether that's distance, silence, reduced access, or the loss of influence they rely on. This realization can push them into offering apologies or making temporary adjustments, not because they truly understand the meaning of your boundary, but because your consistency introduces a cost to their behavior. Boundaries backed by action force them to recognize that you are no longer the person they can easily control or pull back into old patterns. A narcissist's biggest fear is losing access, admiration, or influence because these elements are the foundation of their identity and emotional survival. To them, relationships are not emotional bonds. They are resources. You are a source of approval, attention, admiration, or usefulness. When that resource feels secure, they feel powerful. When that resource feels at risk, their entire internal world becomes unstable. This is why they often act arrogantly, dismissively, or cruelly. They assume you will always remain, always forgive, always explain, always tolerate. They depend on your emotional commitment because it guarantees their sense of superiority and control. The moment that commitment becomes uncertain, they feel a deep sense of panic they will never admit to. Losing access means they no longer have an emotional or practical hold over you. Losing admiration means they're not being seen as special or superior. Losing influence means their ability to shape your feelings and reactions is fading. These losses attack their identity because narcissists rely on external validation to maintain their fragile self-worth. They can't create stability internally. Everything hinges on the attention they extract from others. When you stop engaging emotionally, when you pull back, when you stop responding the way you used to, you trigger their fear of becoming insignificant. This fear often causes them to change their methods. They may suddenly become apologetic, overly kind, or dramatically focused on you. They may attempt to recreate the initial phase of idealization to pull you back in. Their apology is not rooted in guilt or empathy, it's rooted in fear. They sense that your emotional distance could turn into physical distance, and that physical distance could turn into a loss of access. They apologize to secure their position, to keep the supply flowing, to ensure they still have a place in your thoughts and life. Their fear of losing influence is also why they react so strongly when you demonstrate independence, stability, or self-respect. To them, these are warning signs that you may no longer be under their emotional command. When admiration and access feel threatened, they experience an internal alarm that pushes them to do whatever is necessary to regain their position, including the rare moment where they offer an apology purely out of self-preservation. Calm detachment is more destabilizing to a narcissist than anger because narcissists thrive on emotional unpredictability and expected reactions. When you react with anger, hurt, or frustration, you are still fueling their system, even if it feels like a confrontation. Every display of emotion, whether it's rage or begging, confirms that they have influence over your state of mind. They interpret emotional intensity as proof that they matter, that they still hold a position of control, and that the drama cycle continues to operate as they expect. Anger can escalate conflict, but it rarely results in genuine change because it operates within the rules of their game, a game they designed to keep you reacting. Calm detachment, however, breaks all the rules. When you detach calmly, you remove the predictable reactions that narcissists rely on to control, provoke, or dominate. You create an emotional void they cannot easily fill. Their typical methods: provocation, blame, guilt, charm stop working because they depend on a response. Without that response, the patterns that sustain their sense of superiority fail. They begin to feel confused and uneasy because the control they took for granted is no longer there. Your calm is disturbing because it signals that their influence is decreasing, that their emotional leverage is ineffective, and that the dynamic they rely on has shifted. Calm detachment is not passive. It is a form of strategic engagement. It communicates that you are still present but no longer available for control. You uphold your limits and your dignity without providing fuel for escalation. Narcissists find this destabilizing because they are not used to resistance that doesn't trigger them emotionally. They are forced to confront the consequences of their behavior in a way that anger could never achieve. When they recognize that their usual strategies are failing, they often feel pressure to adjust, negotiate, or even apologize, not out of true empathy, but because your calm removes the advantage they once had. This approach quietly but effectively shifts the power dynamic. It shows that emotional manipulation no longer works, that access is conditional, and that their influence is limited. By choosing calm detachment over confrontation, you destabilize the narcissist in a way that prompts self-examination and corrective behavior while protecting your own peace. You can't instill empathy in a narcissist, but you can change the situation by changing your actions. Because narcissists operate from self-interest and require external validation rather than internal moral reflection, their emotional structure is not designed to process the pain they inflict on others in a meaningful or compassionate way. Confronting them with how their actions hurt you is unlikely to lead to understanding or regret. They may nod, pretend to agree, or even imitate empathy to maintain control, but genuine emotional connection is rarely possible. Instead of trying to force empathy where there is none, the most effective strategy is to modify the dynamics that make their behavior successful. By changing how you respond, you take away the tools they rely on, forcing them to behave differently if they wish to maintain access or influence. This means removing emotional reactions that previously gave them power. It means enforcing boundaries consistently so that violations have clear consequences. It means refusing to justify, explain, or defend yourself in ways that feed their sense of superiority. By doing this, you shift the balance of power from them to you. The narcissist may not feel regret in the usual sense, but they experience discomfort, frustration, and a sense of loss when their typical strategies fail. This discomfort is what can trigger an apology or an attempt to modify behavior, not empathy. Changing your actions also clearly communicates that your emotional and psychological well-being is your priority. It signals that their ability to manipulate or exploit is limited and conditional. They are forced to confront the reality that the old habits no longer work and that you will not provide the responses they rely on. In reaction, they may attempt reconciliation, an apology, or temporary change, not because they have truly understood the harm caused, but because maintaining their desired position or access now demands a different approach. By focusing on your own consistent actions, detachment, and self-protection, you create an environment where their behavior is no longer unchallenged. This approach does not depend on changing who they are internally, but it changes the way they interact with you externally. Your choices establish the new rules of engagement, compelling them to respond in ways that support your boundaries and safety. Even if empathy is completely absent, forcing accountability shows them their own behavior because narcissists operate in a world shaped by self-deception, justifying their actions and blaming others. They rarely confront the reality of how their actions affect others unless it directly jeopardizes their self-interest. A mirror in this context is not a tool for emotional confrontation or moralizing. It is a reflection of consequences, boundaries, and patterns that they cannot manipulate or disregard. When you hold up a mirror of accountability, you show them what they are doing in a clear, unemotional way, without giving them the usual fuel of your emotions. You reflect behavior, not emotion. And this reflection is difficult for them to dismiss because it operates outside the chaotic back and forth they usually control. Narcissists are used to narratives that support their self-image, often twisting facts, blaming others, and rationalizing their choices. A mirror of accountability exposes a truth they cannot easily distort because it is tied to real consequences or consistent responses. It might be as simple as always leaving a conversation when limits are crossed, keeping records of repeated patterns of hurtful behavior, or calmly pointing out differences between their words and their actions. This form of reflection disrupts their usual control mechanisms because it provides clarity without emotional reaction, something they cannot dominate through charm, control, or guilt. When narcissists encounter these mirrors of accountability, they experience internal conflict. The gap between how they see themselves and the reality of their actions becomes impossible to ignore. They may initially react defensively, deny, or attempt to shift the blame, but